So if you're starting your greenfield factory and your journey towards digitalisation, you want to stop these legacy problems happening. And the way you do that is by really robustly applying, techniques like early equipment management, like hazard and operational reviews, like RCM, right from the word go.
Welcome to the Trend Detection Podcast, powered by Siemens. And now your host, Niall Sullivan.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Trend Detection Podcast. I'm really pleased to be joined by one of our regulars. We were just discussing before, your fourth time now, Richard.
I think so, yeah.
Fantastic. Always nice to have you back. You are memorable, but it's just because I've recorded so many, I forget. So that's just to clarify that. But no, today it's actually Richard who's brought the topic to the table today, and I believe amongst all hundreds of episodes that we haven't really covered. It was probably been mentioned in a few podcasts, but whether we've covered it in depth, and it's all around spare parts and how it fits into your sort of digital transformation strategy, into your maintenance strategy, and maybe even predictive maintenance strategy. Why not throw that into there? But maybe Richard, I guess, because it's been a little while, maybe you could reintroduce yourself to the audience, and then maybe a bit of background to why you brought this topic to the table.
Yeah, so good to see you again, Niall. So I'm an independent consultant in asset management with a particular slant on how to use emerging technologies to improve the asset management lifecycle journey. I've been doing this as an independent for about a year now. Prior to that and the previous conversations we had, I was within RS Group running the reliability and condition monitoring team. And prior to that, my career was in operations and maintenance management, predominantly in the brewing sector. So I normally tell people I've built breweries, run breweries, and maintained breweries.
Yeah, sounds like the dream job to me, to be honest. But being around a brewery, but I guess So on spare parts, where did this sort of come into your mind? Is it something to do with conversations you're having a lot at the moment, Richard?
Yeah, so I collaborate with a AI business called Ensemble AI, who are focused in the use of AI within manufacturing. And we were looking across the asset life cycle and thinking about, what are the unsolved problems that exist in the asset life cycle where AI and data, has yet to deliver a transformational change. So, we started off talking about time series data, and actually Senseye and Siemens is my default example of a good platform and someone who's nailed this. So, let's not try and recreate that capability. But the use of unstructured data and transactional data is one that's, really not been grasped fully yet, in my view. And you look across the asset life cycle, and there's a whole bunch of processes that are well understood, but actually are really difficult to do because they take a huge amount of bandwidth to do them. And they could be processes like RCM studies or hazard and operational reviews, where we know the methodology, but it just takes a lot of human effort to do it. And the one, the specific one around spare parts is, we all know that most factories have got, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds worth of engineering spares. But it's often badly referenced. So it's difficult to understand exactly what you've got. And that leads to an increase in working capital, but also to increase in downtime because you think you don't have the spare part you need. So we decided to really drill into spare parts as an area that's a known problem, definitely not solved, and one where we believe that AI can deliver a transformational step change.
And do you think do you think spare parts, I don't want to use this term lightly, but do you think it's been neglected in some way?
I think very much so, Niall. I think it's we did a bit of Fermi maths, a bit of research, and we reckon there's something like three quarters of a trillion to $1 trillion worth of spare parts across the planet tied up in inventory across factories and other industrial assets, and one that stuff gets put on a shelf and then forgotten about, and the value of that spare part is almost degraded and diluted.
And there are a lot of the processes in place at the moment, I guess. The fact you're talking about digitalising them suggests that a lot of it's very manually, records are kept manually, and tracking of spare parts is done very manually.
I think it's not so much the records, because the spare part is going to be managed through the enterprise asset management platform or the CMOS platform. The challenge there is about item creation. So you deliver a large capital project. The supplier hands you a spare parts list of all the recommended spares, and we all know that the right thing to do with that spare part list is to do a FAMICA study or an RCM study on the asset, identify the spare parts that should be stocked, to cross-reference that with your existing spare parts to make sure you're not adding a duplicate, and to look at your supply chain to see if you can transfer the risk of that spare part into your supply chain rather than holding it yourself. The reality of what happens in almost every industry is that list comes in through the project team late, and there's a lot of pressure on time in order just to get the spares in ready to run the asset, and businesses end up over investing in spare parts during the capital phase. And then exacerbate that problem by not having a common naming convention, so that they bring in, a bearing with the part number the OEM's given it, rather than normalising everything back to a standard naming convention along with the rest of their spare parts. So over time, your factory ends up with, a variety of different naming conventions for spare parts, not a risk-based, reliability-driven approach to stocking decisions, and then a mountain of spare parts that never get consumed.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about this over-investment in spare parts, but then often there's sort of a reluctance or a determination to, and maybe it's not a bad thing, but, to calculate return on investment or potential return on investment from the technology. There's an imbalance, it seems, at the moment, maybe.
Exactly, Niall. I think, an investment in data and, data analysis, as we both know, gets an enormous amount of focus in terms of ROI. But I think with spare parts, because they go on the balance sheet, not hitting the P&L in the first instance, decisions around that investment in working capital are made in a very different way from decisions that are about either a capex or a revenue investment. And my experience across multiple sectors with a lot less rigor. Just to put some stats into it, research would suggest that in an average industrial site, 50 to 60% of the spares on hand never move. And of that, maybe 10% is a genuine insurance spare. So that means that 50% of the stock held in an average industrial setting was a poor investment because it's not moving and it's not an insurance spare. And if you multiply that over the average stock holding of a factory, it rapidly becomes tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds.
Yeah, especially, and I guess also the environmental impact as well of I don't know. Well, I mean, shipping things out, not being able to track where what's in stock and things like that as well. So you're having to rush parts over and that kind of thing.
I mean, there's tons of issues, Niall. There's the working capital impact in the first place. There's the obsolescence risk, because you've got something on the shelf and maybe it'll be obsolete before you need to use it. People tend to be poor at maintaining the maintainable assets within their engineering stores. So people aren't rotating motors to avoid flat spots or checking gearboxes are still in a good condition, etc., etc. So when you do need to use them, you suddenly find they're actually not fit for purpose anyway. So you make this investment, you don't love them enough when they're in the stores, and then you end up having to make emergency distress purchases, when you do need a spare part.
So I guess maybe shift shift the gear a little bit, but in terms of sort of digital transformation and technology and digitalization in general, so how is that now sort of impacting how spare parts are tracked and stored and used, I guess, as well?
So I think, they are, in terms of how they're tracked, as I said, most people will be using their enterprise asset management platform or their CMMS to manage that engineering stock as a transactional, for the transactional element of managing it. What they're not doing though is using technologies in order to manage that stock at a strategic level, to understand what stock they should have, why they're stocking things, and to make those tough choices about where to invest and where to not hold the stock. And that's where obviously the time series analysis through platforms like Senseye is clearly going to tell you when you've got a pending problem and allow you to order a replacement component in with a lead time. But actually, if you've already invested in the wrong stock, it doesn't address it, and it doesn't help you to do the reliability studies that you need to do to choose the stock you should hold on hand in the first place. So things like large language models do give you an opportunity to accelerate the RCM analysis journey, and also to analyse your existing stock on hand to really understand what it is, and normalise the naming convention, so you can compare the same component from different suppliers in a very transparent way.
And I mean, when talking to I guess people in the industry about predictive maintenance, is spare parts like a central part of the conversation, or is it something that's not really considered when you consider downtime and other sustainability factors or other factors?
I think my experience now is when you start talking to people about predictive maintenance and maintenance maturity, and you'll talk about condition monitoring and stuff like that, and then later on in the conversation you'll say, out of interest, do you have a problem with codification of your engineering spares? Are you sitting on a large mountain of non-moving spares? At which point people go, oh my god, if only you knew how big my spare part mountain is. So it's definitely something that people recognise as a big problem, but I think don't necessarily join it together with part of an overarching maintenance strategy. For me, management of engineering spares is equally as important as your condition monitoring strategy or your work planning strategy, in order to ensure you've got an effective maintenance organisation.
And we also, very closely related to this, of course, is data. And data is probably, if you go back through all of these podcasts I record, data is probably at the heart of most of the discussions. And I guess it's exactly the same for spare parts strategies, right? You need to utilise data. Again, at the recent mainstream event we both attended, we're talking someone who's collected 3 years worth of data, right, from their machines. But is it a case about how to apply it and the context behind it, I guess?
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, there's lots of different data associated with your spare parts. The first and for me most important is the naming data. The being really crystal clear of what the component is and what the attributes of that component are. You then got the risk-based reliability data about whether you should hold that stock in the first place. And you've got the transactional data that tells you how much you consume, which you can use to set your stocking strategy, your min-max, and reorder points. So there's a lot of different types of data that really could do with being managed for an engineering spares. And the average CMS platform will simply manage the transactional data associated with it, rather than the reliability data and the naming data.
And why is that? I guess just from my own knowledge. I mean, others out there probably know all this, but just from my own
I think
information.
It is hard because one supplier will call a component a different thing from another supplier, because People don't want transparency of their supply chain, because if you've built a bearing into your machine, you don't necessarily want people knowing exactly which OEM bearing it is, because you want that after sales revenue to go through you as the machine manufacturer. And you want to maintain some mystique about what that bearing is. The reality is the bearings probably come from one of the mainstream bearing manufacturers. And actually, as a consumer, as a customer, you'd rather get it directly from the bearing OEM rather than through the machine manufacturer. So part of that is deliberate obfuscation of the provenance of the bearing. The next thing is, it's not the most sexy and exciting thing to spend your time in a maintenance environment. If you're out there on the cutting edge of condition monitoring and looking at your trends of data and going, I can predict this is going to fail in 3 months' time. It's much more exciting than trawling through master data around engineering spares. And I am absolutely convinced that the accounting treatment of engineering spares, of having it on the balance sheet, does push it down the radar for people, because it's not, if you're a budget holder and you put 100 grand's worth of stock on the balance sheet, that doesn't hit your budget. You don't see that because it's seen an increase in working capital, and the size of the working capital in spares is normally substantially smaller than the working capital tied up in raw materials and finished goods, which means that even the finance community are not necessarily banging the drum about it, because it's a fraction of the cost of your raws and your raw materials and finished product.
Yeah, so it goes under the radar a little bit.
Yeah, despite being a big number. Back in my old Heineken days, we would maybe have 100 million of finished goods and raw materials, and 8 million pounds worth of engineering spares. So it's only 8% of the working capital, but it is 8 million pounds. And if that was hitting your budget as a maintenance manager, I'm sure you'd pay a lot more attention to it.
Yeah, and I guess, and to your point, talk about maybe sexier technology, things to worry about than what people can't see the quotes. I realise on a podcast, but I was quoting it. But so you talked about more exciting technologies like condition monitoring, predictive maintenance stuff. But is there something? How can we get people excited about spare parts? Maybe that's the question.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just talking about it and talking about the real problems, because people are used to talking about spares in terms of the procurement journey and the relationship with their supply chain. I think they're less confident talking about the spare parts they've got on hand and talking about how to manage that better. So, for me, just raising the topic and talking about technology can be a solution to this problem in a way that it's not been possible to do it in the past. In the past, it's required individual engineers to trawl through masses of data to do that cross-referencing of spares. But actually, with the advent of technology, you can use that to do the heavy lifting quickly, and then the engineers can bring in more interesting professional judgment into the should we stock it or not, because they're not tied up with just the fairly tedious cross-referencing element of it. So I think calling out the opportunity technology gives to do the fun stuff with spares of my reliability study says I should carry these spare parts, and get technology to do the heavy lifting about the cross-referencing and naming nomenclature challenge.
Yeah. No, exactly. I think everything we've said so far, it's sort of an underserved a part of the maintenance strategy. I mean, broadening it out a little bit. Are there other areas as well? I know we're talking about spare parts, but are there other areas that sort of fall under the radar?
Yeah, I think knowledge management is definitely another underserved area where the emergence of LLMs gives fantastic opportunity to do things differently. I was talking to, I think back to my old life when I was running, breweries, managing the maintenance in breweries. None of those were in their first flush of youth. We had assets, up to 30, 40, 50 years old. Imagine a project team comes in and delivers a new asset. And in their folder structure, is everything you want to know about those assets on the day that they are commissioned. The asset gets commissioned, and that project team disperses, and suddenly that knowledge, even if it's still on a shared drive somewhere, suddenly becomes incredibly difficult to access. And certainly at 2 o'clock in the morning, when a technician's trying to solve the problem, is nigh on impossible to access. But actually, LLMs give the opportunity of ingesting all that data associated with an asset, and starting to be able to query that data using natural language. So actually, what is the as-built state of my production asset? What production assets do I own? What's the right maintenance strategy for those assets? What are the common repeat failures that we've already had? What did I do in order to address the previous time this occurrence happened? And put all that insight, in the hands of a technician at 2 in the morning, for me is very, very transformational in terms of how knowledge management works across the asset lifecycle, all the way from acquisition through to operations, maintenance, and ultimately disposal.
And I guess you could talk about LLMs, but also apply it to spare parts inventory. First, I've been done already, and then link it through to what say a predictive maintenance platform like Senseye is saying. Right, you can sort of
exactly. I mean, the area I'm exploring at the moment is you get all this insight into the asset. Suddenly your RCM study becomes something you can do in hours and days rather than something in weeks and months, which traditionally an RCM study would take to do. So you can very, very rapidly build out the right maintenance program. That RCM study will tell you where condition monitoring will create value. Which are the failure modes you should address through condition monitoring, and which are the failure modes you should address through holding spare parts. And then clearly platforms like Senseye are then incredibly important for, now I know that the data points I need to track, in real time is A, B, and C. Fantastic. We now know the value add data to feed into Senseye. And the failure modes where I need to hold spare parts and insurance. So that, you then come in with a really integrated maintenance strategy for that asset, really based on, fundamental reliability theory and a deep understanding of the knowledge management around that asset.
And like you said, I think that's the where we are today is that you can dive deeper and get the answers to the questions, very, very quickly. Whereas before, you'd have to do so much manual lookup. So in a way, that's already sort of kicking off the process of digitalization for the spare parts aspect.
Exactly. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work on using large language models on RCM in the last 12 months, and getting to a stage where you can get a really high quality first draft of an RCM study on a pretty complicated asset in a couple of hours, rather than the weeks and weeks it traditionally takes. And in that RCM study, real clarity on why this is the right thing to put condition monitoring on, which of course then allows you to really focus your return on investment conversations, because we now know that I'm not just chucking data at everything. I'm focused on the data that creates value, as well as what spare parts to hold, as well as cross-referencing my existing spare parts.
Yeah, and actually, maybe that's a nice way to close, because it sort of links to. I was going to one of my final questions would be around sort of executive buy-in and how to sort of justify a focus or an investment sort of in spare parts and the management of spare parts. So maybe we could sort of continue that thread. But how would you justify, and where would you start, Richard, if you're advising an organisation?
If you're sitting on a spare parts mountain of £10 million, which is not out of the question by any stretch of imagination, to then go and talk to your finance community about, I can take 10% out of my working capital, take £1 million out of my working capital through an investment. That's a really easy payback conversation. There's no real mystique around that, because your cost of capital, the cost of holding that stock, and therefore the value of reducing it. And the value, so the value creation is relatively simple, even just from a working capital perspective. If you start coming from a reduction in downtime perspective, again, I can reduce my mean time to repair by doing X, Y, Z, by having better spare parts on hand. Then that just reinforces the conversation further.
Exactly. And I mean, if you were, maybe we could even talk about, someone's almost starting from scratch with digitalization. Would spare parts be toward, because I know of course, digital transformation doesn't all happen at once. It's sort of a step-by-step approach, but is spare parts a natural starting point, do you think, or is it something to build towards?
I think spare parts is where I'll start the answer again. The spare part mountain that most people sit upon is a legacy problem. So if you're starting your greenfield factory and your journey towards digitalization, you want to stop these legacy problems happening. And the way you do that is by really robustly applying, techniques like early equipment management, like hazard and operational reviews, like RCM, right from the word go. So if I was starting in a greenfield, I would absolutely start with my knowledge management and my life cycle management toolkit that I know how to do on paper, but I don't do because it's too costly, and applying it in there. If I'm coming into a legacy factory, then actually it depends, because it depends what the burning platform problem for that that business is. If they're in control, but have a mountain of spares that's not moving, then that's a good place to start. If they're getting loads and loads of failures because they don't have the right capabilities in the team, then clearly you want to start on skill development rather than on data management. So it depends on what your current problem is, Niall, I think, as to where you enter into that digitization journey. But the point for me is, time series data analysis, master data, knowledge management, transactional analysis of your spare part consumption, that they're all different lenses to look at the life cycle, the asset life cycle through. And true digital transformation, I believe, will come when you're deploying all those data tools, rather than just looking through a single lens of time series data or transactional data or knowledge management.
No, I'm doing my usual thing here where I say final question and then I add on 3 more questions. But
yeah.
The final question is around that knowledge management piece. And we talk about knowledge management. People even in the business and organisations should look way to capture that knowledge. And maybe it applies to different parts of maintenance. But is that the same with spare parts? So people know almost instinctively what they've got in stock and what a feel for it. It's more of a feeling than stuff in spreadsheets and in and whatever. And there'll
be a technician who goes, I know we've got one of these at the back of the cupboard, or who goes, I know we don't have this part, but I know you can use this part as an alternative. So knowledge management is about taking that tribalistic knowledge and turning it into more generally available knowledge.
Exactly. But no, fantastic. So I think we've covered quite a lot in 30 minutes. Unless there's any final advice for people to take away, Richard?
I think, take more care what you put on stock. Make sure that these, expensive decisions about what you put on stock are actually being made at the right organisational level. So you wouldn't make £100,000 decision at the bottom of the organisation normally, but somehow in spare parts they do seem to be made at a very low level in the organisation.
I like it. I like having a nice takeaway for people at the end as well. But that was So final thing. I keep thinking of these things. But how do people find out more about you, Richard, if they want to learn more?
So there's a bunch of stuff on my LinkedIn profile. Or just drop me an email. So my company's called 26 TWO number 6 So it's richard@26.co.uk, and just drop me an email.
Awesome. Yeah, so we'll link to those in the show notes as well.
Excellent.
But yeah, for today, thank you again, Richard. You'll be back on again soon, and I'll remember this is the fourth time you've been on. I will remember next time. It's recorded, so it's there out there. But no, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and
Excellent.
with the audience.
Cheers, Niall. Thanks very much. Good to see you again.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for listening, wherever you are out there, and see you on the next episode. Thank you very much.
Please like and subscribe on all major podcast channels and find out more about Senseye Predictive Maintenance at Siemens.com.